In 1945, American sailors pulled a drowning German submarine engineer from the Atlantic. 6 weeks later, he was teaching at MIT. This is the story the history books missed. Dr. Hinrich Müller stood at the front of a lecture hall in Cambridge, Massachusetts, staring at 50 American naval officers, taking notes on his every word. 3 months ago, he had been designing electric torpedoes in a bunker outside Hamburg, while Allied bombs turned his city to rubble. 2 months ago, his U-boat sank in the North Atlantic. Oil-black water flooded past his knees. 6 weeks ago, he had surrendered to American sailors, certain he would spend years breaking rocks in some remote labor camp. Now he was teaching submarine warfare to the enemy at MIT. With a chalkboard, hot coffee, and a paycheck, he watched a young lieutenant frantically sketch the torpedo guidance system. Hinrich had just explained the same system that had sent 17 Allied merchant ships to the bottom. The same system Hinrich had sworn to keep secret. The same system the Americans did not need him to reveal because they had already reverse-engineered 3 of them and wanted to know if their analysis was correct. Every calculation was correct. Dr. Müller, the lieutenant, asked in careful German, "Why did you mount the gyroscope here instead of here?" Hinrich picked up the chalk. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the absurdity of the moment. 6 weeks ago, he would have died before answering that question. Now he was being paid to answer it. He had 5 theories about why the Americans were doing this. All of them were wrong. The truth was simpler than he had imagined, and far more impressive. To understand how a German submarine engineer ended up teaching at MIT instead of digging ditches, we need to go back to the moment everything he thought he knew about America shattered like glass. April 17th, 1945, North Atlantic, 200 m east of Newfoundland. U-873 was dying. The American destroyer had come out of nowhere. Hinrich had been checking a faulty solenoid in the forward torpedo room when the first depth charge hit. The explosions walked up the hall like a giant's footsteps. Rivets popped, steam pipes burst, men screamed. Hinrich had been through depth charge attacks before 3 times in the last year, but this was different. These Americans knew exactly where to drop them. They were not guessing, they were not lucky. They had technology Hinrich did not understand. Surface, surface, Captain Lone Steinhoff was shouting from the control room, but the diving planes were jammed. Hinrich grabbed a wrench. His engineering mind still working even as ice-cold seawater poured through a split seam. If he could just bypass the hydraulic line, reroute through the emergency system. The second depth charge hit directly above the control room. Everything went white, then dark, then wet. When Hinrich came to, he was floating face up, lungs burning, debris everywhere. The submarine had surfaced on its own, but the hull was cracked open like an egg. Men were already in the water, some swimming, some just floating. Around him, the North Atlantic was a chaos of oil slicks and floating wreckage. He could taste dill fuel. His ears rang from the explosions. Somewhere to his left, a young ensign, barely 19 years old, was crying for his mother. He expected the American destroyer to machine gun them in the water. That is what the propaganda film showed. That is what happened to enemies of the Reich who refused to die honorably. In Goebbels's newsreels, American soldiers were portrayed as ruthless barbarians who took no prisoners. The destroyer's bow cut through the wreckage toward them. Hinrich closed his eyes and waited for bullets. Instead, he heard English words he had learned in university. "Grab the line, we have got you." He opened his eyes. American sailors were throwing life preservers, not shooting, throwing life preservers. Young men leaning over the rails, shouting encouragement in broken German, tossing ropes to their enemies. "What are they doing?" Steinhoff gasped beside him, treading water. "I do not know," Hinrich said, but he was about to find out. And what he discovered would change everything he thought he knew about America. American sailors hauled Hinrich onto the destroyer USS Buckley like he was one of their own. Strong hands grabbed his arms. Someone wrapped him in a wool blanket that smelled like cigarettes and coffee. A medic could not have been older than 22, wrapped him in the blanket and checked his pupils, his pulse, asked him in broken German if he could feel his fingers. Hinrich could feel his fingers. He could feel everything. The warmth of the blanket, the stability of the deck beneath him, the absence of bullets entering his body. He looked around the deck. 27 men from U-873 had made it. 27 survivors out of a crew of 52. American sailors were moving between them, handing out blankets, checking injuries, offering cigarettes. One American sailor, seeing Hinrich shivering, took off his own dry jacket and draped it over Heinrich's shoulders. "You are going to be okay, buddy," the sailor said, even though Heinrich was the enemy who had been trying to sink American ships just an hour ago. "Drink this." Another medic handed him something hot in a metal cup. It was soup, beef, and vegetables. Real vegetables, not the grey paste they had been eating on U-873 for the last 3 months. Heinrich's hands shook as he held the cup. When was the last time he had tasted real beef? January? February? Hinrich's training officer had told him that American ships barely had enough food for their own crews. "They are weak," the officer had said soft. "They waste resources on comfort while we remain strong through discipline and sacrifice." The soup tasted like heaven. "You are an officer." An American lieutenant commander stood over him, not hostile, just curious. He had a clipboard and a fountain pen. Name and rank: Dr. Hinrich Müller, Corvette Captain, Engineering Specialist. Heinrich waited for the beating or the interrogation or whatever came next. The American made notes. Doctor of what? Electrical Engineering. Technical University of Berlin, class of 1938. The American's eyebrows went up. "Yes." "What is your specialization?" This had to be a trick. They wanted him to reveal technical secrets so they could torture the details out of him later or use the information against him in a trial. "Torpedo guidance systems," Hinrich heard himself say. Why was he answering? Maybe the cold, maybe the shock, maybe the soup, maybe the way these Americans were treating German submariners like human beings instead of war criminals. The American wrote something down, tore off a sheet, handed it to another officer. "Get him dry clothes and put him with a technical group. Command is going to want to talk to this one." Technical group. But the American was already walking away, shouting orders about salvaging U-873's electronics before she went down completely. Heinrich watched American sailors diving into the freezing water, risking their lives to save his submarine's equipment. Not to deny it to Germany, the war was clearly almost over. Berlin would fall any day now. They were salvaging it to study it, to learn from it, to understand how their enemy had been thinking. "This is how they are winning," he whispered to Steinhoff, who was wrapped in a blanket beside him, drinking his own cup of soup. "What they do not just fight, they learn." What Heinrich did not know was that he was part of an experiment, one that would change how America fought every war that followed. Here is what happened next. May 2nd, 1945, Fort Hunt, Virginia. They called it a post office box, PO Box 1142. But Heinrich had been around enough military installations to know interrogation facilities when he saw them. The guards, the fences, the sense of secrets behind every door. Except this was not like any interrogation he had expected. The American officer, a commander, William Spears, sat across from Heinrich at a regular table in a regular room with regular chairs. No shackles, no stress positions, no darkness or cold or psychological pressure, just coffee and cigarettes and questions. There was even a window. Heinrich could see Virginia trees outside, green with spring growth. "Walk me through the T-11 acoustic torpedo," Spears said, sliding a technical drawing across the table. "We found 3 intact units, but the documentation is mostly burned." Hinrich stared at the drawing. It was accurate, frighteningly accurate. The Americans had already figured out 90% of the system just from reverse engineering. They had identified the hydrophone array, the signal processing circuit, even the detonation trigger mechanism. "I do not have to tell you anything," Hinrich said carefully. "Geneva Convention, that is correct. Geneva Convention protects you." Spears lit a cigarette, offered one to Hinrich. Heinrich took it. His first real cigarette in 6 months. "But here is the thing. We have got the hardware, we have got the how. What we do not have is the why you made certain design choices. Why you mounted the hydrophone array at this angle instead of that one. Why you use this signal processing algorithm instead of something simpler. Why do you care? The war is ending." Spears looked at him like he was slow. "Because we want to make better torpedoes, and because Japan is still fighting, and we need every advantage we can get in the Pacific." It was so simple, so American, not how do we protect against this, but how do we make ours better. Also, Spears continued, tapping ash into a tray. "We are going to need submarine engineers for reconstruction. Germany is going to need to rebuild its entire maritime infrastructure after this war. Every port, every shipyard, every commercial vessel, a lot of civilian maritime engineering jobs coming up. War Crimes Tribunal is going to hang the SS and the Gestapo and anyone who ran concentration camps, but engineers who just did engineering. Nobody is prosecuting you for making a good torpedo." Heinrich felt something crack inside his chest. "You want me to help you? I am saying your expertise has value. War is almost over," Hitler is dead, Berlin is falling, your U-boat fleet is destroyed. The question now is not about winning the war we have already won. The question is what happens next, what you want to do after. Spears pushed the drawing closer. So the hydrophone array, why that angle? Heinrich looked at the diagram, at the coffee, at the American officer who saw him as an engineer first and an enemy second, at the window with its view of peaceful Virginia springtime. He picked up a pencil. The angle reduces cavitation noise from the torpedo's own propeller, he said, and began to explain. Over the next 4 weeks, Hinrich learned something that would stagger him. The numbers he discovered explained everything about why Germany lost, and they were not what he expected. May 15, 1945, 3 weeks into his debriefing, Commander Spears brought in a parade of American engineers, men from MIT, Caltech, the Naval Research Laboratory. They treated Hinrich like a colleague, not a prisoner. They showed him American torpedo designs and asked for feedback. They argued with him about acoustic signatures and battery efficiency and hull metallurgy, and they questioned everything. Hinrich had spent 3 years at the Marine Technical School in Kiel. The instructors were brilliant. Yes, some of the best submarine engineers in the world, but they were also rigid. Everything was doctrine, everything was hierarchy. You did not question the Herr Professor's torpedo design, even if you saw a flaw, because questioning implied criticism, and criticism implied disloyalty, and disloyalty meant a very different kind of interview with very different kinds of officers. The Americans questioned everything. Why did you use copper wiring here instead of aluminum? An American engineer asked during a briefing on electrical systems. Weight savings, Hinrich said. Aluminum is lighter, but copper is more conductive. Does not the resistance loss cost you efficiency? In Germany, Hinrich would have said those were the specifications and moved on. To question specifications was to question authority, but here they actually wanted to discuss it. They wanted to understand the trade-offs. Yes, he admitted we lost approximately 3% efficiency, but the weight savings allowed us to carry more battery capacity, which gave us longer underwater endurance overall. For the Atlantic convoy routes, endurance mattered more than efficiency. The American made notes, trade-offs. What if you used copper but reduced battery capacity slightly to compensate for the weight? They spent an hour gaming out variations, not because there was a war to win. Germany had surrendered 3 weeks ago, but because they genuinely wanted to understand the engineering problem, they wanted to know not just what worked, but why it worked and what might work better. This, Heinrich realized, was America's secret. They did not just have more resources, they had more minds working on problems, and those minds were free to think, free to question, free to fail, and try again. June 1, 1945, 6 weeks after capture, a young MIT engineer named Patterson pulled Heinrich aside after a technical session. They had been discussing battery thermal management. Commander Spears says, "You might be interested in some teaching work. MIT is going to need submarine warfare instructors for the naval training program." And for MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Yes, you would be perfect. PhD from a top technical university. Combat experience, design background. Patterson said it like it was obvious, like enemy engineers became American professors every day. Pay is decent, housing stipend, cafeteria is not bad, Cambridge is nice in the fall. I'm a prisoner of war, yes, right now, but Spears is working on that technical parole program. A couple other German engineers are already in the pipeline. Navy needs expertise for the Pacific campaign, and for whatever comes after there was going to be an after. Heinrich had been so focused on survival, on making it through each day, that he had not really thought about after. Think about it, Patterson said, handing him a folder with MIT information. Classes start in September, June 15, 1945. Cambridge, Massachusetts. Commander Spears kept his word. Heinrich was not sent to a P camp. American officials put him on something called a technical parole. He had a small apartment near campus, just one room, but it was his, and it had heat and running water. He had a library card, a meal ticket for the cafeteria, and a teaching schedule. His first lecture was on submarine pressure hull design. Heinrich had expected hostile students. He was, after all, teaching men whose brothers and friends might have died from German torpedoes. But the lecture hall filled with officers who had brought notebooks and asked technical questions without a trace of personal animosity. They wanted to know about stress calculations, about welding techniques, about the German approach to silent running. They took notes like their lives depended on it, because they did. Some of these men would be commanding submarines in the Pacific within months. After class, a young lieutenant approached. He stood by Heinrich's desk for a moment, not speaking. There was a pause. The lieutenant's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched and unclenched. Dr. Müller, my brother, was on a destroyer that got hit by a T-11. Atlantic convoy duty, February 1944. He survived, but 23 men did not. Hinrich's stomach dropped. He felt his throat tighten. How many brothers had his torpedoes killed? How many sons? How many fathers? The American was asking about engineering, but Hinrich was calculating grief. I am very sorry. The lieutenant nodded slowly. I just wanted to understand how the targeting worked because we need to design better countermeasures. My brother is still out there, still on convoy duty. I want to make sure what happened to his ship does not happen again. He was not angry. He wanted to learn, he wanted to protect his brother. Hinrich explained the acoustic signature recognition algorithm. The lieutenant listened carefully, asked smart questions, took detailed notes. By the end, he was sketching out potential jamming technologies, ways to confuse the acoustic sensors, ways to save lives. We might have something here, the lieutenant said. Thanks for your time, Doc. He offered his hand. Hinrich shook it. Hinrich stood alone in the lecture hall afterward, trying to process what had just happened. This American's brother was alive because he got lucky, and the American had just thanked Hinrich, thanked him for explaining the weapon so they could prevent future deaths. This was not just good intelligence practice. This was something deeper, something about how Americans thought about problems and solutions. Dr. Patricia Wilson, an MIT physics professor, explained it over lunch in the faculty cafeteria. Hinrich had been nervous about eating with American faculty, but Wilson had invited him specifically. She was in her 40s, sharply direct. You have to understand American engineering culture, she said, stabbing her fork at a piece of meatloaf. We do not care if the idea came from Germany, Britain, Japan, or Mars. If it works, we want to know how and why. If it does not work, we want to know why not. Edison tested 10,000 light bulb filaments before he found one that worked. The Wright brothers crashed dozens of planes. We learned from failure, always have. That is how progress happens, but I was your enemy. You were past tense. Now you are an engineer who knows things we do not know. Why would we waste that? She sipped her coffee. This whole country is built by people who came from somewhere else. German immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, Chinese, Japanese. My grandparents came from Ireland during the potato famine. We are used to learning from people with different backgrounds. It is kind of our whole thing. E pluribus unum out of many one. Hinrich thought about the Technical University of Berlin, where only properly German engineers were allowed to teach after 1935, where Jewish professors had been expelled regardless of their brilliance. Where ideas were valued based on the source, not the merit, where conformity mattered more than creativity. We lost, he said quietly, because you think like this, and we did not, Wilson shrugged. You lost because you started a war and made powerful enemies. But yes, this open approach to knowledge certainly helped us win it. Over the following months, Hinrich discovered numbers that explained everything. The scale of what America had built, and they terrified him. Germany had built approximately 1,150 U-boat during the entire war using every shipyard in the Reich. Every ounce of steel they could SCRGE, every engineer they could draft or coerce. America had built 200 submarines, but they had also built 2,700 Liberty ships, 147 aircraft carriers, 860 destroyers, while producing more aircraft than the rest of the world combined, while feeding both their own troops and Britain's population, while developing the atomic bomb. How? Hinrich asked Patterson during a tour of a naval facility in Connecticut. They were watching a submarine under construction. How did you build so much? Germany devoted everything to the war effort, everything, and you still outbuilt us by factors I cannot even calculate. Patterson pointed at the assembly line. See those workers? Half of them are women. During the Depression, they could not get jobs because men had priority. Now they are welding pressure holes and wiring electrical systems. That woman over there. He gestured toward a woman in coveralls checking blueprints. She has got a degree in mechanical engineering from Cornell, but could not work as an engineer before the war because she is a woman. Could not get hired. Now she is a lead designer on submarine electrical systems. One of our best. Hinrich watched the female engineer checking calculations on a submarine's ballast system, making notes, consulting with male engineers who treated her input as equally valuable. In Germany, she would have been working in a kitchen or a munitions factory. Here she was solving differential equations that would keep submarines alive underwater. You let anybody who can do the job, Patterson continued. Your system wasted half your brain power by excluding women and Jews and anybody who was not the right kind of German. You had brilliant Jewish scientists, Einstein, for God's sake, and you drove them out. They came here, they worked for us. We used everybody who could contribute. That is how we built so much. Hinrich stared at the assembly line, watching women and men, black workers and white workers, all building a submarine together. You won because you did not waste your people. That is exactly right. The sailors who threw those life preservers to Hinrich in the North Atlantic, they were just kids, 19, 20 years old, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit. They had been taught to hate the enemy, but in that moment, they chose to save them. That choice made 50 times by 50 different sailors that day. That was America's real weapon, not superior technology, not unlimited resources, the willingness to see human beings even in enemies. September 1948, 3 years later, Dr. Hinrich Müller, now a tenure professor at MIT, sat in his office grading exams. His English was fluent now, barely a trace of accent left. He had published 2 papers on acoustic torpedo guidance papers that helped American submarines operate more safely and quietly. He had helped design countermeasures that made American submarines quieter and safer. He had trained 200 American naval officers, many of whom wrote to him from their postings around the world. A knock on the door. A young German student, part of the new wave of German students allowed to study in America under the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, America's $15 billion investment to rebuild Europe, including Germany. Their enemy was not just about money, it was about knowledge, about rebuilding not just factories and roads, but also educational systems and scientific communities. Engineers like Hinrich were both students and teachers in a new kind of warfare, the peace. Professor Müller, I have a question about the lecture on acoustic wave propagation. Hinrich looked up at the young man. 18, maybe 19, the age Hinrich had been when he started at the Technical University in Berlin, full of pride in German engineering superiority, convinced that German science was the best in the world. Come in, Hinrich said in German. They spoke for an hour about engineering, about creativity, about the freedom to question and experiment and fail and try again without fear of political consequences. The young man had grown up in the ruins of Hamburg, had seen what certainty and rigid thinking had cost Germany. Why did you stay in America? The young man finally asked. You could have gone home after the war, helped rebuild Germany directly. Hinrich looked out his office window at the campus. Students walking between classes, American students, German students, British students, even a few Japanese students. Now that the occupation was easing, laboratories where American and German and Japanese and British engineers worked side by side on problems nobody could solve alone. Because I learned what Germany forgot, he said. Engineering is not about national pride or following orders or building weapons to prove you are superior. It is about solving problems. And you solve problems by bringing the best minds together regardless of where they are from or who they used to fight for. He turned back to the student. America did not fly me to MIT because they were soft or naive. They did it because they are practical. Why waste expertise? Why hold grudges when you could build something better? They think 50 years ahead while we were thinking 1 year ahead. That is why they won, and that is why they will keep winning. The young German student took notes, nodding slowly. My professor in Hamburg said the same thing. He said Germany's future is in cooperation, not competition. Your professor is wise. Now, Hinrich said, switching to English. Let us talk about that exam problem you got wrong. Hinrich Müller expected to spend years in a pea camp breaking rocks or digging ditches. Instead, the Americans put him on a plane to MIT and handed him chalk, not because they were naive, because they were strategic. They understood that expertise does not disappear just because a war ends, that an enemy engineer can become an Allied professor. That the German submarine designer who had sunk Allied ships could just as easily teach Americans to build better submarines, and in doing so ensure Germany would never need to build submarines for war again. The Americans won the peace by turning their enemies' expertise into shared knowledge. Hinrich trained American officers who built better submarines. Those submarines kept the seas safe during the Cold War. The countermeasures Hinrich helped design saved countless American lives in conflicts Germany never participated in. And Heinrich's German students, the ones who studied under him through the Marshall Plan, went home and rebuilt Germany's maritime engineering industry peacefully, profitably as American allies. Germany tried to hoard expertise and failed. America tried to share it and built the strongest alliance system in history. That is not weakness, that is strategy. Hinrich Müller thought the Americans had magic, some trick, some resource advantage, some lucky superiority that let them build faster and better. They did not have magic. They had method, and that method built on the simple idea that smart people should solve problems regardless of which side they used to fight for rebuilt a world. Hinrich Müller taught at MIT until his retirement in 1972. He trained over 800 naval officers and published 17 papers on submarine acoustics. He became an American citizen in 1954. He never returned to Germany, though he maintained correspondence with colleagues there. His former students went on to design the nuclear submarine fleet that kept America safe through the Cold War. Some became admirals. Others became professors themselves, teaching the next generation. When he died in 1981, his obituary appeared in both American and German engineering journals. The American obituary called him a bridge between former enemies. The German obituary called him a son of Germany who helped rebuild the world. The enemy who became a colleague. The prisoner who became a professor. That was America's secret weapon.